Welcome to Sacred Matrix, a divine paradigm of love and universal consciousness, with your host, Janet Kira Lessin and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Together, we transform the world.
And now, here are your hosts, Janet Kira and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
You're alive.
Okay. Aloha and welcome to the Sacred Matrix. And I'm your host, Janet Kira Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Alex Lessin. Excuse me. And our producer is Thomas Becker, also known as the Mad Painter. And you're listening to us on Revolution Radio Studio B. And today our guest is James Krug. He was on with us about a month and a half ago. And he's going to talk about, I forgot what we're talking about today. Anyway, he will tell us. Thought I had it here, but it looks like it's, anyway, James is has served as the Planetarium Director of the Neil Armstrong Planetarium in Altoona, PA since 2003. And he's a high school astronomy teacher. So he's going to teach us today. He's our teacher. And he co-founded the Space Race Museum in the Planetarium's lobby in 2016. And he founded the Mount Lion Observatory at Fort Roberdeau Historic Site in 2018. And he hosts public and private sky shows throughout the year. And he teaches a 9-week adult evening course with topics ranging from conspiracies to UFOs to the Apollo missions to night sky study every winter. And he's the state section director for MUFON, and he does lectures, and he's talks about Planet X Nibiru. Anyway, he's what do you call it? He's a mainstream guy that's talking about these alternative subjects like the Anunnaki and Nibiru and conspiracy. So he's right. He's our kind of guy. He's right down our alley. So, what would you like to say, Sasha?
Well, I've been obsessing on this one astronomical event, that reputed astronomical event that's reported in the Cobran Bible, and also in the account of the fall of the Minos by when Stromboli, when the Thera goes off, and right there's this gigantic wave going in two directions, and it all starts by some astronomical event, whatever that was. And I wonder if you know anything about that.
Welcome, James.
Oh, thank you both for having me, Janet. We were going to discuss the pursuit of anti-gravity tonight, if that would be okay with you both.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, here it is. I missed it. The Pursuit of Antigravity.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
So you did this lecture at a MUFON Philadelphia conference. Okay. So yes, let's talk about that.
That is correct. Oh, well, thank you very much for having me tonight. So the lecture I did was very well received, and it was about anti-gravity. How close are we to being able to overcome the bounds of Earth's relentless pull? Is there a chance that the ancients already knew about this and it has been lost through history? And is there even a chance that we have a secret space program today that might already be using these principles? So it's a wide-ranging topic, and I think we'll have a lot of fun with it tonight.
Oh, definitely. I have many secret space program whistleblowers, experiencers that have been on our program the last 5, 6, 7 years. And they've been talking about their energy systems, right? And one is the M drive, and apparently there are some there's new information coming out. Then we have Dan Cooper in here on the 31st of this month talking about the new patents and what the government's been releasing. So you wouldn't find it unless you were researching patents, and that's what he does. He's creating patents. So he came across all this information. And so let's see how your information correlates with that. We won't know for a couple of weeks, but This is very interesting that this is the topic tonight. So yes, we have ancient astronauts, and they definitely didn't use just rocket technology. And then we have the modern era, and many people have been on board ships, including myself, and seen them, and they're operating on some kind of anti-gravity. So can you explain that to us?
Sure.
What do you think they're using?
Well, that's really funny that you asked that, because the first part of this, I have about 7 different ideas that are being used right now or attempted to be used to overcome Earth's magnetic field. And for each one of them, we can just speculate about how close it actually is to UFO technology. So feel free to interrupt me at any time. I think the first thing I wanted to explain to our listeners is we don't want to confuse anti-gravity with what's called weightlessness. And weightlessness, they used to always say zero gravity. Like if an astronaut was floating in a spaceship, they would say he or she is weightless. And they've really replaced that over time with the more proper term of microgravity, because even if you're orbiting above the Earth as an astronaut, you still are feeling Earth's gravitational pull. And so we don't want to confuse anti-gravity with weightlessness. The reason that weightlessness happens, the floating that we see when we watch astronauts on TV, is think about the sort of queasy feeling you get for a split second if you're in an elevator that suddenly lurches forward, or you're in a car that goes over a humpback bridge. That's basically what the astronauts are feeling every second of every day that they're in space, which is why over half of them tend to get space sick as soon as they go up. So basically, weightlessness is constantly falling around the Earth. And it was actually way back in Isaac Newton's time that he actually figured this out. And he used a simple analogy of a cannon on a very, very high mountain on the Earth. And the more and more gunpowder you pack into the cannon, the farther and farther a cannonball will shoot before Earth's gravitational pull brings it back down. And Newton realized way back in the 1600s that if you gave a cannon enough gunpowder, the cannonball would fire so fast that even as it dropped, Earth's surface would curve away at the same rate. It would actually go into orbit. And so such a cannon wasn't possible back then, but ever since the U.S. Mercury program and the Soviet Vostok program, we've basically been able to build rockets that can actually do that, not just for satellites, but human beings as well. So I just wanted to distinguish to your viewers, when we say anti-gravity, we're talking here about something totally different. We're talking about actually repelling the gravitational pull of the Earth. And if we could actually do this, all types of futuristic space travel would be possible. So that's what I think we're going to be talking about tonight.
Okay.
Is that like the slingshotting that they use, that principle to use the going around a planet to make a probe go faster?
You're exactly right, Dr. Sasha. They have used that for a number of deep space missions, like the Voyager missions, and it's very fascinating. They will basically dip the probe just into the edge of the planet's gravitational well, and that allows the space probe to pick up a great deal of speed, and it'll then release from that well and head out to the next planet. That's how they got some of these deep space probes, like the Pioneers, like the Voyagers, going as fast as they did. Even when they sent the Apollo astronauts to the moon, they actually had them orbit around the Earth a few times before they then ignited the final stage to send them out. So you're exactly right.
In the Sumerian accounts, they also say the opposite of slowing down as before making planetfall by going against that turn of the planet, anti-gravitational.
It is really fascinating how a lot of the descriptions in these ancient texts, people initially assumed that they were just science fiction, but they now read very, very closely to what people are describing today. I'm sure you probably both know the story of Joseph Blumrich. For listeners who don't know, Blumrich was an actual NASA scientist, and he took a lot of offense to the idea that people thought in the Old Testament of the Bible that some of the books, like Ezekiel, were not actually describing God, but were actually describing an advanced civilization. And in one particular encounter that Ezekiel has with God, Blumreich thought, enough. I'm going to sit down. I'm going to recreate all the measurements that Ezekiel made in his own descriptions, and I'm going to prove once and for all that this is nonsense. But once Blumreich actually sat down to do this, and he accurately recreated the dimensions that Ezekiel relayed, to his shock, he found it made a very aerodynamic-looking craft, very similar to what people might describe as a UFO today. And on the legs of the craft, when the ship got very, very close to the ground, protrusions not unlike helicopters actually popped out so that it could come in for a nice soft landing. Even later in Ezekiel, he describes the quote-unquote temple that they make for God, and Blumreich recreated that too. And it just so happened that the dimensions of the temple allowed this craft to basically sit down perfectly inside of it. So that was one NASA scientist who totally changed course, and he ended up writing a book called The Spaceships of Ezekiel, which was very, very popular.
Wow, thank you.
So just a little bit. Go ahead, Janet.
I had a question. What is gravity? We don't even really know what gravity is, right? How can we have anti-gravity? How do we figure this out? What is gravity?
That's an excellent question. There are basically four fundamental forces that we know of. We know of gravity and electromagnetism. So back in the late 1800s, scientists realized that electricity and magnetism were basically two different manifestations of the same thing. We have the strong nuclear force, which basically keeps the nuclei of atoms together. And then we also have the weak nuclear force that would allow for things like radioactive decay. And sometimes the biggest breakthroughs in science happen when two things that are thought to be totally different phenomenon are actually realized to be manifestations of the same thing, like electricity and magnetism. So a big pursuit of scientists today is to try to unite all these forces in something called a theory of everything. Now, to your direct point, Janet, I would say that we still don't understand as much about gravity as we should. The best, most complete work we have so far comes from the great Albert Einstein and his theory of general relativity, which he discovered back in the 19-teens. However, it's basically a theory of geometry more than anything. So he took what Isaac Newton said about gravity and he refined it even more. According to Einstein, very large masses like a planet, like the moon, like the sun, will actually bend or warp the fabric of space-time around it. So for a three-dimensional example, just pretend that you and some friends might have a thin rubber bed sheet that you're holding taut at the corners. If you threw a tennis ball into the middle of it, that might show how a small mass star would bend the fabric of space-time. If you threw a much larger ball, maybe even like a bowling ball, that would show how something massive like a black hole would bend space-time. So through general relativity, we've been able to accurately predict exactly how the planets would move around the sun. So in this theory, we would say that the planets don't move around the sun because the sun, quote unquote, has gravity. We would basically say the mass of the sun would bend the unseen fabric of outer space, and then the planets are basically like little marbles that are rolling around it. With that being said, that's basically the best that we know right now. We recognize gravity as a theory of geometry. And out of the four fundamental forces, which I just mentioned, so far it's the only one that doesn't have a subatomic particle associated with it. So some physicists out there are still looking for the so-called gravity particle. And there's also been some really wild interpretations. I've even seen one interpretation that one physicist believes we're looking at gravity entirely wrong. And instead of thinking about it like a pulling and an attraction, it's actually more of a push. So there are some sort of far out theories, but to your point, there certainly is a lot we don't know about gravity yet.
Great question. Okay, so continue.
Sure.
The pursuit of anti-gravity.
So here's a quick rundown of what scientists are doing right now to try to overcome gravity and whether any of these things would really work with UFO propulsion. One idea that's very fascinating is called acoustic levitation, where scientists can actually use sound waves to basically make objects float. So think about a slinky that you've stretched a long distance and you're at one end, and let's say that Dr. Sasha is at the other. If you would both wiggle the slinky back and forth, it would basically make an S wave that they would call a transverse wave. Instead, though, if you held the slinky and pushed and pulled it, that's going to make a longitudinal wave. And when we do that with sound waves, you can levitate very tiny objects like grains of rice, tiny little spiders, and it's a really cool effect. You can see videos of it. However, I would say this is probably unlikely to work for UFO propulsion. For starters, sound waves aren't strong enough to actually levitate really massive objects. And then the other issue we have, everybody, is once you get out into the airless vacuum of outer space, unlike light, sound can't travel through a vacuum. So even though acoustic levitation is a really, really cool thing to see, I don't think it probably works for UFOs. The second idea that we're still learning a lot about that has great potential are called superconductors. And they're pretty fascinating. They're objects that when you cool them way, way down, we're talking hundreds of degrees below zero, they actually lose all their electrical resistance. And one of the sort of weird quirks about that is when you lose your electrical resistance, the object starts to repel a gravity field on its own, and it will actually float. These are called superconductors. And they work by something called the Meissner effect. And what's really fascinating to me is if you see a diagram of this, when an object repels a magnetic field and the field sweeps around it, it basically looks exactly like the shape of a UFO. So what type of superconductors do we have so far? Well, all the ones that we know of so far have to be cooled way, way down until they'll actually superconduct. Back in 1986, there was a big breakthrough. They found one that only had to be cooled down to about 180 degrees Celsius below zero to superconduct. And so that was within the range of liquid nitrogen. So even in a lot of physics classrooms across the country now, they'll actually do this demonstration where they can actually make something float. So one of the big barriers right now, everybody, is physicists are looking for what's called a room temperature superconductor. And if we could find one of these, we could actually make UFOs. It would basically give us the anti-gravity properties without having to make it really, really cold. So my guess is, and I'd love to hear you chime in, I would say UFOs probably have some element of superconduction to them today. Witnesses never really described being cold inside a UFO, but even in our MRI machines today, we do use superconductors, but it's isolated with a vacuum. So even patients inside them never actually feel cold. So I think probably someday if we figure this out, there will be some element of superconductors as part of it.
Okay. So it's not, well, what is the temperature in space? Is there a temperature? Is it?
Oh, that's actually that's an excellent question. In space, officially, it's only a couple degrees above absolute zero. So that's actually a really interesting observation. In the vacuum of outer space, we really wouldn't have much trouble getting it cold enough to use a superconductor. I've never really thought about that. I guess the biggest barrier would be having to use something else when you're actually in the atmosphere of a planet. and then it's much warmer. But yeah, you're exactly right. That would be an easy way to cool something down.
Mm-hmm. Now, this you had a PowerPoint. We mentioned a PowerPoint. Do you have any illustrations you can use your share screen and show us something? Because I am recording the video for later.
Yes, I would be.
There's a little thing.
Share screen, yeah.
A little thing where it has two squares, I guess.
Yep, I see it.
Together. And if you let me share screen. Show us some of these.
Sure. I think I can make this work. Just give me 1 minute. Okay. Can you see my screen now, Janet?
No, unfortunately.
Let me try one more time. No, it says something.
We'll go and navigate to something to share. Maybe that'll... I don't know how you do this. Anyway, We'll figure this out someday. But
that's okay. Let me just try one more time. It says I'm sharing from my end, but I know that Skype can be a tricky devil. Let me try one more time.
Yeah, you need to share from your end.
Okay, got it. Okay. Let's see here. It says that I'm sharing, Janet. Do you see anything from your end at all?
No. Matt, do you see anything on your end? No. Oh, wait. Anyway, we'll just keep going so we don't have dead air.
Sure.
All right.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Okay, so we'll have to test it sometime when we're not live on the radio and see if we can get the share screen to work. Then we can record the the videos for later.
Sure. And keep in mind, you also do have a copy of this presentation, Janet, so you could always put some visuals on your website as well.
Yes. Okay. Alrighty. So let us continue.
Sure. Well, let me just give you a couple more of the fun ones because I certainly don't want to get too technical here. One idea, since I know you're both fascinated with ancient texts, this actually comes up throughout the Vedic text, and that is called mercury vortex propulsion. So the idea here is you take the element mercury, which is a very unique element. It's one of only two on the whole periodic table that is actually liquid at room temperature. And the ancients seemingly were fascinated by it. It's usually dubbed quicksilver. And very recently, they actually found rivers of mercury in the tomb of a ruler. And so did the ancients just like it because it looked really cool, or was there something else to it? And so this legend actually starts with something called red mercury. And officially, it did not actually exist. But Samuel T. Cohen, who is usually known as the father of the neutron bomb, came out and said red mercury absolutely is real. So I've researched it the best I could. And one of the funny things about it, nobody totally knows why it's called red. Some people think this was the case because it was from Russia. Others think the isotope itself was colored red. Samuel Cohen said they would actually take regular mercury and mix it with a radioactive waste. But it was rumored to be found on Nazi U-boats bound for Antarctica. And so red mercury has always been quite a legend. In fact, a number of years ago in the Middle East, a rumor surfaced that red mercury could be found inside Singer sewing machines. So a lot of mom and pop sewing machine shops ended up getting robbed for their sewing machines. So it's got a great urban legend around it. But so it was rumored to be found on Nazi U-boats bound for Antarctica. And this leads to a lot of the stories that the Third Reich was not totally eliminated at the end of World War II, that some of it continued on either in Antarctica or in places like Argentina and Chile in South America. And so scientists today have tried to dabble with rotating mercury rapidly to try to reduce its mass, like the Vedic text said. And it seems like so far it doesn't reduce it enough to create a significant lift. But this is portrayed in detail in these Vedic texts, and this supposedly powered the Vimanas, which could do very similar things to what UFOs are described as today. They could levitate, they could make rapid changes in direction, they could visit other star systems, they could unleash powerful weapons. So some people think some of the secret to UFO propulsion actually does lie with Mercury. Any thoughts on that?
Your turn, Josh.
Well, what I'm, of course, wondering about is to what degree consciousness of the craft or the people operating it enters into this, and if so, is a Mercury a catalyst with some kind of psychoactive substance, which is another whole way of looking at what might be happening.
Well, it's funny that you mention that, because if you look at the direction our own military aircraft are going, the cutting edge technology right now is all about the synthesis of a pilot with his or her machine. And they've made some really phenomenal aerodynamic progress. They've actually gotten to the point with our newer airplanes like the F-22 Raptor. They're actually going against conventional aerodynamics. They're actually making these things intentionally unaerodynamic or intentionally unstable. And with their fly-by-wire technology, that can actually make these crafts make much more rapid direction changes. And so we're getting closer and closer to UFO in that way. And we are getting closer and closer to the pilots being directly wired into these ships, as you alluded to. And this has actually been a concept that's been out there for a while. I'm sure that you've both heard of the Kenneth Arnold sighting, which happened back in 1947 in June, just a couple weeks before the Roswell crash. And it's generally considered the first highly credible UFO sighting in the United States. And one of the fascinating things that Arnold said about the UFOs, and this was actually well ahead of his time, he did not think there were actually little green men inside piloting these things. He thought that the craft itself was actually a sentient entity, and it was working as one cohesive unit. So that is actually an idea that's been around for some time, and it looks like our aircraft are getting a lot closer to it.
Well, that's really interesting. You mentioned that the craft itself was a sentient entity. Because I've had an encounter with a craft, and it came hovering over my porch here. I have a deck in front of my house, and it appeared kind of like blinked in. It was a clear day. It just blinked in. It kind of like untwisted. Maybe this makes sense to you. It looked like it was unfolding itself, right? And so it twisted and then folded itself, and then it kind of, the closest I can describe it is it looked like the craft on Star Wars, where they were kind of hovering across the planet, and they said, and they went up to the guard, and he said, "These are not the droids you're looking for." It was a funny little craft. I don't know if you remember that craft, but it was like a sport model, right? I call it the sport model, and it wasn't much bigger than, let's say, a limo, a small limo, not the real huge one, but a small limo. So it was just there for the longest time. I was on the phone with my girlfriend. I said, "You won't believe what happened. There's this craft here." And then I just started to go for my camera to take a picture. And then it very strong telepathic communication. If you try to take a picture, we're going to blink out right here and now. And I said, okay. And then I was asking, well, who's in the craft? And they said, there's no other beings inside of this craft. I am the intelligence of this craft. I am the craft.
Wow.
This is a sentient craft. And so that was my direct communication about 3 years ago. You know.
Well, not only is that a phenomenal story, but that actually gives me a perfect segue into the last two types of anti-gravity we are going to talk about. So thank you for that, Janet. That sounds great.
Well,
the term sport model, when it comes to UFOs, was actually coined by a famous and somewhat controversial scientist named Bob Lazar. And so our next idea of anti-gravity comes from something that Lazar described back in 1989 in an interview with George Knapp. So Lazar, not too many people knew him at the time, but he came forward and he said that he was a physicist working at the S4 region of Area 51. And to Lazar's credit, he actually provided his ID badge and a number of pay stubs to show, in fact, he did work at Area 51 in some capacity. And Lazar claimed that he was part of a group that would reverse engineer a UFO. So for any listeners who aren't familiar with the term, reverse engineering means they would basically bring in a crashed craft well above their current technology, and the physicists would basically try to take it apart to see how it worked. And so Lazar described an element that he called element 115. And he said it was a very, very special element, and basically an antimatter generator would make gravity waves that powered these UFOs. Well, at the time, the mainstream media totally chortled at Lazar's claims because at the time, the periodic table only went up to about uranium. But since then, a number of elements have been created in a laboratory setting, and element 115 now officially exists. And it's either called unpentium or it is also called, I apologize, I just lost it. Okay, there it is. And so element 115 actually does exist now, but one of the problems is it only exists for a very, very short amount of time. It only actually exists for about 200 milliseconds. And it does seem to have very similar properties to what Lazar actually described. And so today it's called moscovium, and they make it by bombarding element 95, americium, with calcium element 20. So 95 plus the 20 equals the 115. So right now we can make it, but only in a laboratory setting for a very, very short amount of time. But Lazar claimed that in the future, scientists would actually discover a more stable kind that would actually stay in this form. So that might be something that we could actually use someday.
I found your, I can't get the share screen to work, but I found your PowerPoint. We'll have to do this someday, or I'll put it in here somehow. So it was called Unpentium, and then on Avatar, Unobtanium, right? Very close.
Sure. I'm glad.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
Unobtainium.
Oh,
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought up Avatar because that was the basic premise in Avatar, which came out in 2009, that humans were on a distant moon mining unobtainium, which was supposedly a natural room temperature superconductor. So you're exactly right. That's the whole premise of the movie Avatar.
Right. Yeah, so Bob Lazar has come back on the scene. I wonder if he's still singing the same song or if he's changed the story.
Well,
anyway,
he is actually, and yeah. I just saw the History Channel had a special on him, and even to this day, he actually gets rated fairly regularly by the government just because of what he's working on in his own personal laboratory. So he is still alive, and I think a lot of people now believe he must be pretty close to the truth in some areas, or I don't think he would be receiving the interest that he is from the government.
Right. So we have a lot of stories that the government has reverse engineered technology that they got from extraterrestrials. Some say they're crashes, some say they were delivered, or some combination. Do you think that they're crashing craft? From what I heard, that the ETs, or at least the Greys, can sense when somebody is, whatever they're thinking, and so they know what you're going to do before you do it. That's why they can't be crashed, because they can purposely get out of the way. Now, they may be delivering us advanced technology, so we reverse engineer it and become more conscious and get some technology. What do you think about that?
That's a great question, and I've read a number of different angles on that. I have read what you first alluded to, that it's almost impossible to shoot something like that down because they've basically been able to manipulate space-time to where they know something's going to happen before it actually does. However, with regards to, we could say, the Roswell crash, there's a number of different theories there. One idea is that at the time, since that was so close to Socorro, New Mexico, where they were beginning the Manhattan Project to actually test some of these atomic bombs, is that the United States was actually using a new type of radar, which for us was very, very new, but for a much more advanced civilization would have been so primitive that they almost weren't guarding against it. So one theory was that our primitive technology was actually interfering with their navigational equipment, and it was actually knocking a few of these out of the sky. But to your second point, Janet, one of the more fascinating accounts I read, and this came from a book written by the late Jim Mars, where a team of remote viewers actually tried to remote view the Roswell crash before it was happening. And they got the sense of the occupants in the ship that they felt a sense of foreboding, but they also felt a sense of duty. And so in this theory, at least according to what the remote viewers said, that this crash intentionally happened because it would allow our civilization to move forward. So the crew of the craft basically was taking one for the team, so to speak. And then finally, there is the idea out there that there is an active exchange. Probably one of the more sinister conspiracies with extraterrestrials is the so-called Greta Treaty. So during President Eisenhower's time in office, he always took an annual fishing trip every single year. And in one particular year, right after his fishing trip, he suddenly announced he was taking another vacation to Palm Springs, which people found odd because he had just gotten back from vacation. And during his time in Palm Springs, California, President Eisenhower went totally AWOL for 2 days straight. Now, even back then, even though the Secret Service wasn't what it is today, anytime you lose the President of the United States for 2 days straight, that's a really big deal. And so when Eisenhower surfaced 2 days later, his press secretary said that Ike just had to have emergency dental work done. But a number of stories have now surfaced that he was secretly taken to nearby Holloman Air Force Base, also in California, where a supposed first contact meeting happened with another civilization. And this is where the story gets rather sinister. The United States supposedly did sign an agreement where we were given some technology, but it came at a great cost. We basically had to look the other way while another civilization, in this case potentially the Greys, conducted their own activity here. And as the story goes, the other civilization apparently violated this treaty very, very quickly. The UFO technology we were given was not nearly as good as what was promised. And it turned out that they were being far more invasive here than they originally led the U.S. to believe. There's even a side shoot to this theory that originally Eisenhower met with some more friendly civilizations, perhaps the Nordics, and they didn't offer any technology, but they offered to help us develop our spirituality to a greater level. And the United States supposedly rejected that and went with the second group. So some believe that's why there's all the secrecy today, is to cover up this idea that we already have an agreement in place.
Oh, I have a couple comments. Okay. So to that, the Greys can do whatever they damn well please. I don't see how you could really make an agreement with them. I guess that they didn't know what they were dealing with back then, but the stories are the Greys actually came earlier, that Truman encountered them. That's how what's Taken, the Spielberg movie Taken, which was very, a lot with all those different stories. So it might be as early as Truman. But anyway, what I know with the Greys, and I've dealt with the Greys a lot, is they don't really seek or require permission to do whatever they want to do. And they've probably been doing this all along. So that was just something, a story that they were telling, I guess. So, I don't know. It doesn't make sense because they really didn't need permission to take it.
You saw the Greys cooperating with the U.S. military, Janet.
Well, I've seen the Greys cooperating with the military many times. So, anyway, so that was just a little aside there. Now, back to the Roswell. There were two craft at Roswell. So in Area 51, and I think Bob Lazar got to work on it, is a full craft that was delivered. There was one that was broken into the pieces, and that's probably the sense of dread and foreboding and duty that Jim Mars was reporting with the remote viewing. But my whistleblower said that they weren't really sentient life forms. They were avatars. And since we've seen the movie Avatar, we know that you can have your soldier sitting in one location and he projects his consciousness into a body of another type. So that's her theory, was that these were avatars. The one that survived the crash, so to speak, was named Errol the Grey. And Errol was interviewed by Lawrence Spencer. Or no, he wasn't interviewed by Lawrence Spencer. There was a nurse that was able to hear telepathy from the Grey, so she was recruited to talk to Errol the Greys, and she was the only one who could hear her and interpret what was being said, and then she would write it down and they would type it up. So anyway, there's all these stories, and it's like connecting the dots. What do you think about that, both of you? What do you?
Well, this the story that we get of the Serpo really providing an ambassador and the Yellow Book, and having 8 Americans go to their place in Zeta Reticula, and some of them just spending the rest of their life there. They liked it so much it was like Idaho, they said.
And that was supposed to be Kennedy's agreement. Have you heard of the Project Serpo?
Yes, I have. I've read all of the Serpo disclosures, and I'm very much on the fence with Serpo. On one hand, you have a number of credible military insiders that did say that Serpo was actually real. On the flip side, you have a number of UFO researchers who think that it may actually be a disinformation program. I find all the disclosures fascinating. For those of you listeners who might not know, Serpo is an alleged human extraterrestrial exchange program with a civilization that supposedly orbits around the Zeta Reticuli star system, which is about 40 light years away. The ending of Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind, on which he was advised by NASA, matches the exchange of the Serpo program. But there are some issues that I have with it. For one, it would require faster than light communication, and we don't totally know how that would be attainable yet. But one of the biggest issues that I have with it is, if you read all the disclosures, they don't provide a lot of evidence that would be all that difficult to fake. I think despite the thousands of rolls of film that they took and the tens of thousands of pictures, so far there's only really been one picture released from supposedly being on this desert world, and a lot of people think that it might just be a picture of the desert in the southwest U.S. So I'm not saying that Serpo isn't true, but I'm very much on the fence with it, and I also don't think we can rule out, even based on the different versions of Roswell you just shared, I think some of these things might be intentional disinformation to try to occlude the truth that actually did take place.
Right. And we know that happens all the time, information disinformation. Now, you brought up faster than light communication. So we have the story in the ancients about communicating with Nibiru. Now, Nibiru is supposed to be within our binary system, our binary solar system, two suns. Would that be the same problem as communicating with Serpo, or would that be closer in? It would just be more. Yeah, I'm confused. How will we communicate from here to Pluto? Would there be a delay?
Yes, you're exactly right. There would be a delay. For example, much closer to home, anytime that NASA sends a space probe to Mars, when it lands, it has to be totally automated, because even when Earth and Mars are at their closest, it's about 7 light minutes away, meaning it would take a signal from Earth about 7 minutes to reach that probe, and then it would take about another 7 minutes for a signal to return so NASA could see if it actually worked. If you're talking about the legend of Nibiru, some believe that that is a binary star, as you said. If it is, it probably would never get farther away than about 1 light year away from the sun at the very most. So that might be a year or less of communication time. The issue we would run into with a star system like Serpo, Janet, is it's 40 light years away. So even if we did have people there as part of an exchange program, it would take 40 years for Earth to send a signal out to Serpo, and then it would take another 40 years for a return signal to come back. So that would be 80 years, which was well beyond the actual length of that program. However, there is one shortcut around that. So if it would be okay with both of you, before we get to the end of the first hour, could we just talk about the last 2 potential types of anti-gravity, and then in the second hour we can talk about the ancients, the Nazis, everything like that?
Yes. But I wanted to say one more thing about communication, is that Caroline Corey was saying that everything is in a grid and that there's many singularities that kind of go across time and space. Explain Caroline's theory, because you're better at it than I am.
Oh, there's a geometrical point, a singularity within everything, where they're all connected and they're simultaneously they're connected, and you're free of this matrix that we operate in of time space. That's basically what she said.
And that might be how they're communicating through the singularities that are throughout the grid that is connected not only to the Earth but into space. And I see you have a grid on your Bob Lazarian Pentium
yes.
graphic that you were doing. And then Nelson Herman talks about the singularity within everything that connects everything, and that's why everything is one. You can mathematically graph out all the singularities from the biggest item to the smallest in existence.
And the other thing is that, Caston says that when they were going to Serpo, there was a place where they actually shifted the craft into a bigger craft, and the motive, however that was transporting or moving, was different and changed.
Well, I'm a big believer in that theory. One of the tenets of remote viewing is you can basically tap into that, and time is no longer an obstacle. Trained remote viewers can view any event at any distance at any time if they're good enough. So I definitely do buy into the idea of the universal grid for sure. One of the only issues, if you actually read all the Serpo disclosures, is the disclosure said they actually had a physical satellite relay network set up, and that's how they were able to send and receive the messages. And they even went into detail about how it took a great deal of time for the humans and the extraterrestrials to be able to speak the same language. So I totally agree with you. I think that could be done with the mind. There's a number of people even who have had near-death experiences, and one fascinating thing they almost always say is they said they could observe everything, and it was like time didn't exist. All events were happening simultaneously in the same instant. So I'm a strong believer in that, just like you. I'm just not sure it's possible with a physical satellite relay system.
Right. So I didn't read the book. Did you read about
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And that reminds me of another whistleblower. She said they were around a black hole, or whatever you want to call it, wormhole. I'm not sure which one it was, what's the difference. But she said that they would communicate, and they would have to wait. They would send something through the wormhole, and then they would have to wait to get the response. So there was a delay there. I'm not sure what was going on there. So you're saying that they used some kind of technology and there was a delay. Yeah, there's holes in things. I'm not sure.
Oh, well.
Order or the interpretation.
Sure. Communicating through a wormhole is a fascinating idea. So wormholes were speculated decades ago as basically joining together two black holes. And if you had the possibility of a wormhole, it could theoretically allow you a shortcut to a faraway place in space or even a different place in time. And if you read enough UFO literature, there is this idea that there's already an established network out there of these wormholes that could allow you to travel very rapidly. If you've ever seen the end of the movie Contact, which was based on Carl Sagan's book Contact, Jodie Foster gets into such a system at the end. One of the only problems with wormholes, though, let's say you could go into one black hole. At the other end, if it puts you out into another black hole, you're still just stuck in that black hole. So some physicists think the other end of a black hole might actually be something they call a white hole. And if you think of a black hole as sucking everything in, a white hole would basically shoot everything out. So they've never officially found one in outer space yet, but that might be one way that you could actually communicate and travel through a wormhole.
Wow.
Maybe that's what a yin-yang symbol is. That's what Lessin Herman, he animated the yin-yang symbol. So when the light hole and the dark hole, I have to find that animation. He did it in a live workshop, and he showed how it was animated. So that was the concept, that the white hole lined up with the dark hole, and that was the singularity. So
Janet, that's an amazing idea. I love.
Toro lifts you out of that system and into a different realm.
I love that idea. Some of the thoughts, that's great.
Wow. So yeah, we have I guess 3 minutes to the top of the hour.
Sure. Well, because you brought up black holes, the last thing I can share before the top of the hour, one of the other ideas comes from Einstein's general relativity, and that's actually bending the fabric of space-time itself. And some think that you could create a ship, and even if it wouldn't have a strong mass like a planet or like a star, if you gave it a strong enough electromagnetic field, it could actually do the same thing. And so you might have two distant stars, but if you temporarily bended the fabric of space-time between them, you could actually bring those two stars very, very close together, hop across the bend, and then release it. And you could actually get there faster than a beam of light could. So in the next hour, if you'd like, we could certainly talk about that. It also dovetails nicely with legends of the Philadelphia experiment that the United States inadvertently figured out how to do this way back during World War II.
And, that's the exact same thing that A.R. Borton suggested they could do, that when Nibiru was supposed to pass through so that we would be safe and the danger would be past.
Right.
That's really fascinating.
And we've had different speakers on Revolution Radio, John Teeter and Dan Cooper, and they both claim to have traveled any ships that go faster than light, or it goes through time. They said if you're going that fast, you're actually traveling through time. So time and space and the propulsion systems they work hand in hand. So that might be how they're doing it. They're somehow going through time.
It's fascinating, and it would also describe why a lot of eyewitnesses claim to see UFOs changing shape. In this idea, they're not actually changing shape, but they're bending space-time around them, and then that distorts the light coming from it. So I think probably someday if we figure out UFO propulsion, I'm sure space-time bending has a big part to play in it.
One of the most interesting photos from above, you see a UFO, and there's a plane on the ground, and it gets diaphanous, and then it's gone. It goes through stages of transparency.
That's top down. That.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
We're an anarcho-syndicalist commune. We take it in turns to act as a sort of executive officer for the week. Yes. But all the decisions of that officer have to be ratified at a special bi-weekly meeting. Yes, I see. By a civil majority in the case of purely internal affairs. Be quiet. But by a 2/3 majority in the case of more... Be quiet. I order you to be quiet. Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left. Yes, I have. Look! It's just a flesh wound.
I don't believe I've seen such a display of courage, skill, nerve, grace, and stupidity.
I'll do you for that. Oh, what? Come here. What are you going to do, bleed on me? I'm invincible. You're a loony. The Black Knight always triumphs.
Roundtable Live, Monday through Friday, 1 a.m. till 4 a.m. Eastern Time. Bring your mind, bring your ideas, bring your voice. King Arthur had nothing on us. Here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com.
Enjoy your extra big-ass fries.
You didn't give me no fries. I got an empty box.
Would you like another extra big-ass fries?
I said I didn't get any.
Thank you. Your account has been charged. Your balance is 0. Please come back when you can afford to make a purchase.
No.
I'm sorry you're having
trouble.
Come
on. My kids are starving.
Thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio. Here at Revolution Radio, we believe in freedom of ideas, freedom of speech, but above all, we believe in freedom of existence through self-reliance. This station is 100% listener-supported, and as a fundraising promotion, I have a kick-ass free gift for a $100 donation. 35,000 seeds. 25 years in the freezer. Long-term storable, 54 different varieties. So if food prices go crazy, the shit hits the fan, or if you just want to save tons of money every year by creating your own food like I do, grab our seed pack special. Just look for the banner on the homepage at freedomslips.com. Don't be a statistic. Don't be part of the problem. Be part of the solution. We need, as humans, to start taking care of ourselves and not depending on the megacorps to provide unhealthy, nasty food. Included in this package is also a DVD with 900 survival and off-grid living documents and the offline home canning how to do everything website all on the DVD. So when you're growing all that food, you know how to can it, store it, preserve it, etc. with all these documents. So thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I hope that you will pick up this package and start learning to be free. Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, where information never sleeps and freedom is one seed that needs to be planted.
What we do in life, it goes in eternity.
Thanks for tuning in to Revolution Radio. Here at Revolution Radio, we are listener-sponsored and commercial-free. But there still are bills to pay. In order to raise some needed funds to cover the cost, our station is offering a silver special. In the continental United States for a $60 donation, or in Alaska, Hawaii, or Canada for a $70 donation, we will send you an uncirculated 2018 1-ounce pure silver eagle. The $70 donation, the extra 10 is to cover shipping, by the way, outside of the continental United States. When making the donation, you must put Silver Eagle promo in the notes on the donation. And thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio at revolution.radio and freedomslips.com. Without you, there is no us. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
It happens more often than we can imagine. In my case, I was sitting at home, and out of nowhere, I just started feeling uncomfortable. Then it got worse, and I started perspiring. I tried to ignore it, but I waited too long. The chest pain came as we were driving to the hospital emergency. I felt my life clock begin to tick. I barely survived. There was lots of damage done to my heart. What do I do now? I was lucky. I took a leap of faith and tried a 7-herb formula with hawthorn, garlic, cayenne, and more called Extendivite. Herbs have been used for thousands of years to keep us healthy. If you're not using Extendivite as a preventative supplement, maybe it's time to start. To order, call 1-877-928-8822 or visit heartdrop.com.
Extend your life with Extendivite.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Sacred Matrix. And I'm your host, Janet Lessin, with my co-host, Dr. Sasha Alex Lessin. And our producer is Thomas Becker, also known as a Mad Painter. And you're listening to Revolution Radio, Studio B. And our guest is James Krug, and this is part 2. And we're going to go into all kinds of interesting things, including time travel. But before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody to go over to revolution.radio to the upper left-hand tab, and you can make your one-time donation, or you can go to the Patreon link and make your recurring donation. And the archives are coming back online, so when you make your $5 a month donation on Patreon, you get access to the archives, and there's some amazing stuff in there. You can spend the rest of your pandemic sequestering and watch everything 24/7. So here we go. What do you want to say about the second half of our show, honey?
Oh, just when I thought about time travel, I don't remember if it was you or somebody else was saying, well, you know, if you really look at whenever a consciousness focuses, it makes a wave turn into particles. And so we disappear and reappear and disappear and reappear every second.
So one of my favorite kid books was called A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle. And I think she was describing wormhole travel. Did you ever read that book, A Wrinkle in Time?
I did. She talks about a tesseract and it's the time travel device, and it's a fascinating read, and it definitely seems like it was ahead of its time.
Yeah, so I found that when I was young. So I'm 66. It was a long time ago, and I was just I always was aware of all this time travel and ET contact because I'm an experiencer, and I came into the physical realm and I had contact. And so when finally these books and then Star Trek came along, I was just so excited because that was a reality I knew on another level. So I thought, boy, I've landed. What's this crazy planet I'm on? Take me back home. Right? So, okay, so what about time travel? How do we do that?
Yeah, I guess our lead-in would be the seventh and final type of anti-gravity we wanted to talk about, and that's what if ETs are just accessing higher dimensions? So as far as we know, our reality is basically confined to 4 dimensions. 3 dimensions of space, front to back, left to right, up and down, and at least 1 dimension of time. But there's a number of groups out there that believe there are more dimensions than that. The Australian Aborigines, for example, believe that there's at least 2 dimensions of time, the regular dimension of time and the dream time. And even modern physicists who are dabbling in what's called superstring theory think there could be anywhere from 10 to 17 the whole way up to 26 dimensions. And they think a lot of these are really teeny tiny small. But there's a chance that if UFOs are actually higher dimensional beings, and for anyone who's interested in spiritual evolution, as I know you both are, one of the New Age theories is as we go on, we basically try to attain these higher levels as we perfect our souls more and more. So if this is the case, it's not even that these UFOs are actually moving as we know moving. They're basically popping in and out of our dimension. And that's why it seems to military pilots and eyewitnesses that they're actually defying gravity and they're moving in these wild ways. They really aren't. They're basically just peeking in from above. The best analogy that I could give is think about an ant farm. Probably for the ants inside, they can't understand how the face looking in at them is on one side of their lives at one point and then immediately switches to the other side and is then all around them. So I'm sure to the ants it seems very exotic, but to us it's quite common. So now if you pretend that we're the ants, if there was a higher dimensional intelligence, it might be quite easy for them to do that. So higher dimensions can definitely lead us into time travel. But I did want to say, is there anything else that you all wanted to add from your experience with higher dimensions before we talked about time travel directly?
What's Sadie?
No, it's just that it's got dualism and hierarchy built into it when you say higher dimensions and not higher dimensions. I just noticed that.
Yeah. I've often thought. See, I've seen ghosts all my life. So I've seen extraterrestrials, and I often thought they were just in another dimension. I don't know if it's higher or lower. That's the whole theory about we're going up the dimensions. We're going to ascend to the next highest dimension. That's another theory. But
yeah, hierarchy may be a mistake.
But maybe it isn't. It's just another dimension, a different vibratory frequency, and that we're maybe occupying the same space. I've had people that talked about ghosts, and they said, yeah, they're just right there. You walk through them. So maybe they're just all in the same space, but it's just a different vibratory frequency. We're actually walking through each other. So,
sure. And
anyway,
one other theory of extraterrestrials, some even believe that they might actually be future human time travelers coming back to a time where they can basically check on us to try to redirect things. So I think we can easily talk a lot about time travel. And before we even get into traveling to the past versus the future, I think we do definitely have to discuss a great urban legend, because some people believe, if there's any truth to this urban legend, that it could be what the secret space program is using today. And that, of course, is the Philadelphia experiment. So one of the greatest legends of science, probably a lot of you listeners have definitely heard about it. So just the Cliff's Notes version, at the time, this is during World War II, the U.S. naval fleet is being ravaged not only by German U-boats, those predator wolves of the sea, but also by magnetically triggered mines. So what they were attempting to do here was actually trying to cancel the magnetic field of a ship to make them much tougher for U-boats to detect and to make it more difficult for magnetically triggered mines to actually explode. And so this legend comes from a number of people, including a man supposedly known as Carlos Allende. Some think he was a hoaxer and just a teller of great stories, but others find his story very, very credible. And so this involves a destroyer that was called the USS Eldridge. And the Navy apparently was trying to cancel its magnetic field by wrapping hull the whole way around, or wire the whole way around the hull of the ship. And this took place in Philadelphia Harbor, and some believe that Einstein contributed. Some have even gone so far to say that Nikola Tesla, the famous Serbian experimenter and physicist and all-around electrical genius, was not yet actually dead and actually contributed to this too. And so they wrapped wire around the hull of this ship. And then on board the Eldridge, they supposedly had high-frequency generators that they were going to try to turn on to cancel out this magnetic field or even make it optically invisible. And so the idea, according to Allende's accounts, is not that they were actually trying for teleportation, but they may have been attempting something similar to what would make islands supposedly disappear out on the seas to sailors, somewhat of a mirage effect. So the generators are turned on. This supposedly happened in 1943, and a green fog enveloped the ship. They turn the generators off. The crew comes off the ship, and apparently they're very, very nauseous. But the Navy liked the potential of this program, so they replaced them with a different crew, and then they tried again a short time later. This time, they upped the power of the generators, and the ship actually disappeared from visibility, but there was still a hull-shaped imprint left in the water. The Navy was very, very happy about these results, and they turned the generators off. And once again, the crew came off, and they were still very, very nauseous and disoriented. So as the legend goes, the third time is where there was a tragedy, but also great potential success. This time, they added even more power, and this time, the Eldridge supposedly disappeared from Philadelphia Harbor entirely. It then teleported to Norfolk Harbor, a short distance south in Virginia. And this is where Allende, who is supposedly on the nearby USS Andrew Fursish, actually saw the Eldridge appear and then disappear, and it was re-teleported back to Philadelphia. But this time, the crew on board paid a heavy price. Some of the sailors had caught on fire, some had gone insane, some supposedly were even fused into the metal hull of the ship. Like what you both mentioned about earlier, like ghosts, us sharing the same place. In this theory, the teleportation actually had the molecules of the sailors inadvertently sharing the same space as the metal molecules of the ship, and so they're actually fused to the ship. And so some believe this was such a disaster that the program was canceled, but others believe there was so much potential here that the Navy actually continued it in sort of a side spin-off called the Montauk Project that took place at a secret facility on the end of Long Island. So the Philadelphia experiment certainly leads us into a lot of our stories of time travel today.
Right. And we have a friend, Stuart Swerdlow, and he was on board the Eldridge in his previous incarnation. I forget the name of the fellow. Anyway, he fell off the ship with Duncan Cameron and the Cameron brothers. Anyway, they appeared on shore in Montauk in, what year it was. That was 43, I think it was 83. Same date, but 83, in 1983. And that was the Cameron brothers. But Stewart went through time and space, and he found himself being born as a baby. And so, anyway, I don't know if you read that part of the Montauk books.
Well, there's a number of stories about what happened on Montauk, and a lot like what you're describing would be called time loops. So the people actually involved in these would be able to loop to different times where they were both older and younger and then come back to the present. There was even a legend that they accidentally summoned forth what was called the Montauk Monster, that they had brought something through the porthole.
I guess the piece I forgot to say was, in 1983, they knew that this was, it's like every 20 years there's an optimal time. The algorithms of the planet are in alignment, and so that's when they can pull them through. So they went further to develop the time travel teleportation system, and they activated it on the 40th anniversary, and they were able to pull the Cameron brothers, who had gotten kind of lost in between, lost in space, but lost in time and space, and they were able to recover those two. And there was something that they activated. They apparently, if you read the Montauk books by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon is a co-author on some of them, they're able to transport souls into other bodies. It really goes woo-woo, but when you think about it, you know, what happens when we die? Where do we go? Mm-hmm. Are we just going to another dimension? So there's some tie-in with all this time, space travel, and life and death. And then at Montauk, they developed the wormhole capability where they'd open the portal and they would see this future city around the year 6000, and there was a horse, a statue of a horse. And so they kept sending young boys down and tell us what it says. There was a plaque. What does it say on this horse that was up on its hind legs, you know, raised up? Mm-hmm. What happens? Why can't we go anywhere past the year 6000 something or other? Did you read that? I highly recommend this series of books. It's a fascinating read, and I heard they're going to make it into a series. But
Chang's hat.
Huh? No, that was just one of the Ong's hat bet. Yeah, so go ahead. What do you know about the Montauk project?
Sure. Well, for starters, it's really fascinating that you mentioned the 20-year period, because this actually dovetails into another alleged secret space program, and that's using a technology like this to actually transport humans to Mars. There have been a number of people that have come out, and some fairly credible, like Andrew Basiago and Laura Eisenhower, who's the granddaughter of Dwight Eisenhower, and then one man named Michael Relf. And speaking of time loops, Relf said he actually took place in what he dubbed the 20 and back program, which would be a fascinating aspect of time travel if it was actually true. Relf said that as young men, he and other people were basically teleported to Mars through something like a jump room, as he called it. And they would serve a 20-year period of service on Mars, which he claimed was actually far more habitable than space agencies have led us to believe. And then after their 20-year commitment, they were basically jumped backwards through time to almost the exact moment when they left. And so it certainly sounds like science fiction, but as you mentioned from Star Trek earlier, a lot of times what we see in science fiction is really just science fact at a much earlier time. And so for starters, some people believe that that is already happening. And then at Montauk, the book that I can recommend, maybe you've read it, is called The Philadelphia Experiment Murder. It was by Alexandra Bruce, but it was edited by Peter Moon. And they believe that they've actually taken this technology and they're basically using it today. And it's one of the reasons that the United States' military is so feared and unchallenged today, is because we actually have the capabilities to deploy troops anywhere on Earth in just a matter of minutes with this technology. And there have been a few whistleblowers that have come out and said that they've actually experienced it in person. And I even have one personal account to share with you if we do have the time for it.
Sure.
Yes.
Go for it.
So every now and then I will have students whose parents are fairly high up in the military. And I certainly don't want to get the students in any trouble, but I often say, well, if you ever can share any stories without getting in trouble, that would be really awesome. And I've heard some good ones over the years, but one really sticks out. I had this one student years ago named Fred, and Fred had an older brother who was in the Army infantry and was actually being deployed to Afghanistan. And his brother told him after he returned that on the trip over, they had gotten into a big troop transport, and the CO at the time told them all the cell phones had to be shut off and all their watches had to be removed, and they were collected prior to taking off. And he found that a little bit odd, but he didn't actually turn in his cell phone. He snuck and he kept it on him. And he said when they took off, everybody on board suddenly got nauseous and felt very, very odd. And then in his brother's words, it was like as soon as they had taken off, they were landing again. And so before they knew it, they had already crossed the Atlantic Ocean and were now landing in the Middle East. What was even odder to Fred's brother is when he got off the plane, he peeked at his cell phone, and it showed that only about an hour or so had elapsed, even though this journey should have taken a very long time. And so he went to his commanding officer and he said, "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but it seems like hardly any time passed at all." And his commanding officer said something to the effect of, "Oh, that's just jet lag. It happens to everybody." And then knowing he might get in trouble, he pulled out his cell phone and he showed him how it was still reading Eastern Standard Time. He said, "Look, hardly any time's elapsed." And apparently Fred's brother got totally reamed out for this, and he was never supposed to mention it again. So I found that to be a very interesting tale. Obviously, I can't verify it, but it certainly would point to the fact that we might have some technology like that today.
I have heard of that before, yet that they are, and this brings us to what's going on now with our planet recovering. You know, now that we have COVID-19, everybody's in lockdown. So if we have these teleportation systems, and that's wonderful. So we have a soldier, a regular grunt soldier, reporting that he was on this teleportation system. We've heard about these teleportation systems from the 20 and back people. So they're daring to use it with the regular soldiers going to the Far East. So, the Middle East. That's fascinating. So yeah, they can just send all their troops and all of the everything, their support stuff, their weapons, their vehicles, their tanks.
Kasten said that's what the Nazis did at Nuremberg.
So they did it, yeah. So So I'm hoping COVID will stop denying humanity this capability of traveling around the planet, not sticking us in these vehicles like planes and boats that are petri dishes for disease. So that's one of the things. I don't know how we can do this, but talking about this, maybe somehow this will be the next reality. They can save their asses and redeem themselves by saying, "Oh, we've invented this teleportation system. Now we don't have to fly around in planes," because nothing's going to be the same after this whole stuff that's going on right now. So we're going to need this teleportation system so we can travel again. Humans like to travel.
Sure. Well, I guess maybe that would take us right into time travel to the future versus time travel to the past. And maybe one of the reasons this technology is kept from us is even though time travel to the future is pretty straightforward, If you talk about going back to the past, then that opens up a whole separate can of worms. So very quickly, let me just cover time travel to the future and then why traveling back in time is so much more complicated. Would that be okay, Janet, Dr. Sasha?
That sounds great.
Sure. So for anybody who says, I don't believe in time travel, they don't really know what they're talking about. Albert Einstein was actually able to prove that time travel, at least to the future, is possible when he discovered special relativity while working as a Swiss patent clerk back around the year 1905. One of the tenets of special relativity basically puts a speed limit on the universe, and that speed limit is the speed of light. And according to Einstein, nothing can actually travel at the speed of light except light itself. You can get as close to the speed of light as you want. You could go 99.99% the speed of light, but you can never actually attain it. But some curious things happen as you get very close. One thing in particular is called time dilation. Time itself will actually slow down for every astronaut on board such a ship relative to everybody back on the Earth. So it could actually allow you to travel into the future. Now, officially, they've never proven this with humans yet, but physicists have proven it in particle accelerators. So they can take teeny tiny particles that are going to decay radioactively. And if they accelerate them to nearly the speed of light, they decay much more slowly by the exact amount that Einstein predicted. So we know that we can travel into the future. The only thing we're lacking now is the ability to make a ship that humans can do it in. But the past, traveling back in time, is a whole separate reality. So you might think to yourself, well, why is it so much more difficult? If we could go to the future, why not the past? One thing that physicists like to talk about here are called paradoxes. Now, a paradox is not necessarily an impossibility, but it basically looks like a logical contradiction. So probably the most famous one that comes up with traveling back in the past is called the grandfather paradox. Janet or Dr. Sasha, are you familiar with the grandfather paradox?
Yeah, you can't go back and kill your grandfather.
Sure. So basically, if you hopped in a time machine and you went back to a time prior to when your grandfather or your grandmother gave birth to your mom and dad and you killed them, they basically would not be able to have your mom or your dad, who then would not be able to have you. So you should cease to exist. But if you ceased existing, then who just killed your grandfather? So that's basically the grandfather paradox. So physicists have actually figured out two ways around this. And the first way is called timescape, but I actually call this anti-free will. So in timescape, you actually could travel back in time, but sadly you could only do so as an observer, because the first instant that you actually interfered with the past, it would set ripples going forward that would then affect our present. So the example I always give is revisiting the Kennedy assassination, that seminal event in American history, which took place on November 22nd, 1963. So probably a lot of us, if we could time travel, we would probably want to go back and try to stop JFK from being gunned down, because it could have charted America in a different direction. But according to Timescape, you could only go back as an observer. So in this theory, you could go back to Dealey Plaza and you could see either Lee Harvey Oswald, if he was really in the sniper's nest, or maybe another gunman behind the fence on the grassy knoll. But the first time that you actually tried to interfere, some cosmic force would stop you, because that would create contradictions to the eventual present. And so that's idea number one. That's called timescape. The second idea that physicists have is called many worlds. So think about a train in a railroad yard and many branching tracks off of it. So in this theory, you could go back in time and you could actually interfere to stop the Kennedy assassination. Either that's tackling the gunman or somehow being able to get to JFK or the Secret Service and try to convince them that the route was not safe. Somehow you stop it from happening. But as soon as you interfere, a separate world line then branches off to prevent a contradiction. So you still have your original world line where JFK was assassinated, but there would now be a second world line where a time traveler from 2020 went back in time and actually stopped it from happening. So here the world lines would diverge. So it somewhat makes for a happier ending. One of the only problems I have with many worlds, everybody, is physicists tell us it doesn't even have to be a big decision like trying to stop a U.S. president from being murdered. It could be the tiniest decision, even down to the level of a tiny electron jumping up to a new energy level versus staying in the one it's actually in. So in this theory, if many worlds is real, literally every second we would have an infinite amount of world lines branching off, all running together. So what do you both think? Which one do you think makes a little bit more sense, timescape or many worlds?
It seems to me that they're both accurate. They are, that they're both right.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting possibility.
Yeah, I think we already have many worlds happening all the time.
Well, let me just finish the thought, is that for many people in America and in the world, they have in their heads the version that they think is the version, LBJ and the CIA and the mafia and the bankers and each, and so they have these different versions, and they are living with these versions as their truth about whether you can trust our government or not.
It is true that we somewhat do create our own reality as humans, isn't it?
Right, because we all have people that have the way and the light and the truth, and I always laugh when people say, "Well, what do you want? Don't you want that truth?" They go, "What is that truth?" So I think it's kind of like the many worlds, it's a combination of the two. We're all walking around in our own little world, our own universe, and that's why some people try to get us to converge into a consensus reality. So that's why they try to make Jesus is the savior of the world, and that's not truth. And then Muhammad is, and then so everybody tries to get us in alignment with their variation of the cosmos of the universe, of the existence of the reality of the timeline, however you want to symbol it. But we're actually all the time operating in our, and so the road not traveled disappears, but you can always pick it up again. That's another way of symboling it. Like you're going down in distance and you're seeing those different railroad tracks, and you may travel for a while, but anyway.
Existentially, the only place you can really be is now, and your ideas of the future or the past are ideas that you have now.
And we're always rewriting our past. If you go back and visit something that happened, you're going to have a slight variation on what actually did happen. So we're actually time traveling in our minds.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah. Anyway, that's my, it's just whatever you get, enjoy it. But if you don't like it, change the channel.
Sure.
Your timeline.
Perhaps our minds are the greatest time machines of all, and we just haven't really unlocked it yet.
Yeah. Well, some people do. Go ask Alice. But she said so. So I guess that brings us to the dreamscape. But what else did you want to say on these two variations on the theme?
Well, you actually did raise something interesting about slight variations, because there's one last possibility, and it's actually very popular right now on social media, especially with the younger generation. Are you both aware of the Mandela effect?
Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So just for the background for the listeners who perhaps haven't heard of it, the Mandela effect is named after South African civil rights pioneer Nelson Mandela. So while he was protesting apartheid, which was basically the government's decision in South Africa to separate different races. He was basically imprisoned for that for many, many years. And he eventually was released from prison, and he became a very prominent and beloved politician in South Africa. And he actually lived a very, very long life. He lived well into his 90s, except that's not how a lot of people remember it. A lot of people swear up and down that Nelson Mandela died when he was still in prison. In fact, they go so far as to say they recall seeing his funeral televised on TV, and they even remember little subtle details like what color the curtains were in the church where the funeral mass was held. And so that leads us to a phenomenon that's now dubbed the Mandela effect. And it's basically when a collective group of people will misremember something the same exact way. And so what I do in class, if I share this, or in my adult class, and we're talking about time travel, is I will share a number of examples of the Mandela effect. I'll show two different versions of something, and I'll ask the class to try to vote on which version is actually correct. And then I show them the right answer. One example that people always get really excited about, if you've ever heard of or read the Berenstain Bears books, it was a long-running series of children's books written by Stan and Jan Berenstain. And so the question is, how did you spell their last name, Berenstain? Was it S-T-A-I-N or was it S-T-E-I-N? And so there's always a big debate and fight about what the right answer actually is. So when I'm showing these in class, it's very fascinating because I'll have the class vote, and it always ends up being around 50-50. Now, you might think to yourself, how's this tie into time travel? Well, the idea of the Mandela effect, some people just dismiss it, and they think human memory isn't that great, and we're simply misremembering things. But other people ask, what if there really is only one type of time travel? What if there is one overwhelming world line of which we're all a part? And we've now developed the technology where time travelers are going back in time and they're making some changes. And this does have a ripple effect across time. And so far, we're seeing this in very subtle ways. And so people who really believe in this say, we're not misremembering it. We remembered something correctly, but then there was a ripple in time, and that something that we knew actually changed to something else. So I'm somewhat on the fence with it, but it does present a relatively fascinating consequence of what could happen if time travel is actually real.
Well, if there was a ripple in time and it changed it, how are they remembering the alternative timeline? Wouldn't they have changed into the timeline with the correct Berenstain dust?
Sure. That's a great question. So in this theory, Janet, people are actually remembering what happened from years ago correctly. But then the ripple took place after they actually experienced it. So now when they go back for the recollection, now they're seeing the changed reality. And so that gives us somewhat of a cognitive dissonance because our brain is basically faced with two different versions of reality. The one we actually lived and then the one that we actually see, which changed without us knowing it. So it's a lot to wrap your head around, but it is kind of a fascinating consequence of what could happen if certain types of time travel are real.
What about, did you have any comments on that? What about the people that claim that they've used the chronovisor? And a lot of the whistleblowers claim that the government at one point wanted to come out and do disclosure. So I talked to Lyndon Moulton Howe and what was the Face on Mars guy? Hoagland. So this is back in the 90s. And they Lyndon told me how she was taken to a underground installation somewhere in the Midwest, and she was shown a hologram of the crucifixion of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And Andrew Bashanga claims he was shown that as well. And a couple other people, the Cooper guy that got killed.
William Cooper.
He claimed he was William Cooper. Right.
Sure.
And so, and then in Packing for Mars, there was that fellow that said that the Vatican had developed a chronovisor, and so able to view that.
Sure.
So talk about the chronovisor. What do you know about the chronovisor?
Sure. Well, it's funny you mentioned Packing for Mars. That's a book by Mary Roach, and it's really good. I've read it myself. The chronovisor is basically an idea, it's a legend, that a Vatican priest actually developed what looked like a set of glasses that you could basically wear, and it would allow you to look back to any time that you wanted to. And this helped make the Vatican as powerful as it is today. And the Vatican certainly does have a long history of having a tie-in with U.S. intelligence agencies and some of these programs. Like earlier, Dr. Sasha, I know you had mentioned EBE-2, who was supposedly brought back here from the Serpo program. So we sent people there, and then they sent this emissary back. And so there's a story that EBE-2 actually did go to the Vatican, and while she was there, the code name given to her was OSG, which stood for Our Special Guest, and she had actually met with the Pope at the time. So there's a number of stories about that. You had also mentioned the Yellow Book, and certain types of those books also sort of tie in extraterrestrial lore. There's supposedly the Red Book, the Yellow Book, and the Blue Book. And the Yellow Book, I believe, is the most fascinating one. It's supposedly a full account of the history of our universe, which was given to us by an extraterrestrial ambassador. And what's fascinating to me is how they described it sounds very much like a Kindle today, but accounts of the Yellow Book started to come out decades before that was actually invented. And so there's two interesting caveats on the Yellow Book. Supposedly, anyone on Earth can read it, regardless of what language they themselves speak. And as they start to read it, the book will actually appear in the language of the reader. The second thing that's fascinating is apparently you cannot pick up the Yellow Book and resume from the same place you were actually at. So people who have allegedly seen it say it almost resembles a thick piece of plexiglass, and it's somewhat translucent, but has yellow edges and became known as the Yellow Book. And so the problem is a person can read as long as they possibly can, but then the next time they pick up the book, it starts back at the beginning. So apparently there was a concerted effort within whatever branch of intelligence actually had possession of the Yellow Book to actually have somebody read as long as they could and basically relay what they were reading to people who were sitting right there and recording it. And apparently the record was something like 36 hours straight. A man was basically able to dictate from this book for a day and a half straight until he basically passed out due to exhaustion. And so I don't know what to make of it, but it's certainly an interesting, quirky take on what was called the Yellow Book.
What would you have if you had two people reading it together?
Still, it was interesting content that I read in the report was that they took credit in the Yellow Book for sending Jesus to help us out, and we treated him badly.
I had read that myself. I don't believe in the book they actually say the name Jesus, but they did say that they had sent an emissary to us about 2,000 years earlier to spiritually enlighten us. And so if you look back at who made his appearance about 2,000 years ago, it would certainly be Jesus. So I think for some people, that would lead to a great crisis in faith, the idea that Jesus might actually be an ambassador from another civilization. To me, though, even myself being Catholic, my faith is very important to me. It certainly wouldn't bother me that much because we already believe that Jesus is divine and special and basically is an emissary from above. So to me, I think if Jesus was really a spiritual ambassador from another civilization, that would actually be reassuring to me because it would show us that we are on the right track spiritually. But I know for some people it would be rather scandalous, and some think that's why the Vatican is involved with this, because they're trying to keep some of these secrets as long as they possibly can.
Well, I was just looking at the Council of Nicaea, and that was one of the big arguments: was Jesus a mortal person separate from God, or was Jesus the same as God? And the church threw itself into a great internal war about that.
Well, they certainly did. Most theologians would say that Jesus is so special because he is both fully human and fully divine, which nobody else in the history of our planet would be, at least according to the church. But to your point, Dr. Sasha, I believe that's also the council where they truly established the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, basically 3 in 1. And I will say that as a Catholic over the years, it's been very frustrating trying to get a really clear, concise explanation on how the Trinity actually mets itself out. I even remember a number of years ago, I went to Mass at our local cathedral, and I rarely did that. And the priest there told us he was going to focus his homily on the Trinity. And I got really excited about that. I thought that's good because I struggle with understanding that reality to myself, and this man is going to explain it. And unfortunately, the homily was very, very murky. And if anything, it kind of muddied the waters a bit for me. So you're right. The church basically made that decision to go that direction on how they define Jesus and how they define the Trinity. But then the problem is if they ever learn something else that could really give us humans a much better understanding of Jesus, they might have to try to keep that secret because it would contradict what they have long said was established dogma for hundreds of years.
So, yeah.
Yeah, dogma that humans establish by excluding certain other documents of equal interest.
Yeah. So, what if ET came down? That was one of the arguments they had about, why they weren't going to have disclosure, because it would just shatter people's religions. But from our research, religions were established by the Anunnaki as a control mechanism. Not to say there's no truth or validity in any part of it, but our governments that remain take information and they always manipulate it to maximize their own agenda, So they've used a lot of these religions as psychological control mechanisms to control the population because, as Emil said, these creatures are so noisy. Let's just let the flood kill, right? And Enki said no. And he defied him and created the Noah's Ark and allowed part of humanity to continue. Plus, other Anunnaki rebelled and told their people so they would get to the high ground. I guess some of them went underground too. So we have all these stories. We have variations on the theme. We have all these different churches and religions have their interpretations. It's just like eyewitnesses of an accident or something. You have 50 people witness an accident, take them into court, and they're, depending on their perspective, they'll have 50 different variations on what happened in this accident, right? And that's what religion. We have all these different perspectives, just like realities. We have many different multiverses simultaneously. But that was the thing when we were at the conference with Randy Kramer, who's another secret space program. He said that they were going to do disclosure. They were going to use the alien false flag, but they also they were going to do the second coming of Jesus as a manipulation to somehow introduce this information about our interactions with extraterrestrials, which seems to be, according to people like Andrew Bashago and Randy Kramer and all the different 20 back people, our interactions with extraterrestrial is extensive. We have trade and distribution. One of the favorite products is beer. They like our beer and children's clothing, especially the denim blue jeans. So, as a Catholic, how do you reconcile that in your own mind that when this happens, when disclosure happens, everything's going to go out the door? Everything will leave.
Well, God's hinting at it anyway. The Vatican knows, and they've been hinting about it, and they are perfectly happy with God being not just confined to this one planet here.
Yeah.
Sure. I think that you're right. The Vatican has definitely hinted at it. I will say one of the reasons I think we've been held back from disclosure is, as you alluded to, it would truly break down the control structure here on Earth. And it wouldn't just be religion-wise. When I give examples to students, I say, think about all the other industries that would be affected. So, for example, if you think about the richest men on Earth, most of them are oil tycoons. Oil and who has oil reserves really runs the world. But if we met a civilization, and let's say they were willing to give us cold fusion power, suddenly all those oil reserves on Earth are worth nothing. Or even just look at the pushback against extraterrestrial life from the scientific community. And sometimes I tell the students, it's not just astronomers, but I think deep down, most scientists are very leery of us meeting another civilization, because what truly makes a scientist a scientist? It's a man or a woman who has extensive knowledge and training in one area. Usually they're doing research for something that hasn't been discovered, and that basically makes their place in society. But what if we meet a civilization that might be 1,000 years or 10,000 years ahead of us? And what if they act like space brothers to us and they say, human beings, we are here, and as a token of our goodwill, here is the cure for all cancer, which we discovered 500 years ago. Suddenly, all those scientists are no longer going to have a function in our society as well. So to your first question, I think part of the reason that this has been kept hush-hush for so long, it's not just the religious implications, but it would actually affect a lot of other powerful people in a lot of other areas as well. On the religion front, I'm somewhat excited about it. I feel like the majority of the world's religions, even though they differ, I think the common theme is the same. And I also think there's been a number of books about it. People tend to think we're being prepared for that disclosure at some point in the relative future. For example, just think about how much alien imagery you see out there in the media, in advertising. There are products today advertised on TV that really have nothing to do with aliens or astronomy, but they might have an alien as a mascot. So some people believe that this is very intentional, and it's basically to desensitize us. So when it finally does happen, humans aren't nearly as upset as we would have been.
I think one of the things that's happening, disclosure, is the disclosure in our hearts that we're all one on this planet.
Right. And one of the things that's happening is that our old paradigms are going out the door with this COVID thing. So right now, what we're realizing is that whenever you monetize something like energy or like medicine and make it for profit, we never actually get the cures or the free energy system. So we have to shift our society away from, we can't go back to, those aren't the good old days. That was slavery. Whenever you have energy and you've monetized energy, and I'll use it, should be free for everyone. It's a natural resource. All citizens of every planet deserve to share the resources. It's one of our resources. And so if you make energy free, absolutely free, we stop having slavery. We've got to get beyond money. We've got to get beyond, we're only going to give you a vaccine that's going to save your life if we can charge you $500 for it. It's crazy. They make these medicines illegal because they won't make a medicine unless there's enough people sick with a certain disease so they can make a profit for having spent their, this is a paradigm shifter.
It's dominator consciousness. It's hierarchy. It's built into the Anunnaki way of dealing with power and authority. And it's their trip, and there's no reason that we need to be bound by dominator consciousness. And they had their own Me Too movement. Lilith or Nima, who led the goddess movement, which was partnership. And there are alternatives, but men tend to be bigger and be more violent.
Okay, last minute and a half to you, James. Wrap it up. Sure. We're almost out of time.
Oh, sure. I think you made some great points there. It's interesting because it shows the collective power right now that we do have. So oil controlled the world, but during this lockdown, so few people used it, the price of oil dropped to only a couple cents a barrel. Athletes and movie stars ran our society, but during this time, we basically aren't doing any of it, and people are still going on. So I do agree with you. There's a potential of a great paradigm shifter, but boy, is that a threat to the people in power. Decades ago, Nikola Tesla was getting very close to free energy and having a wireless transmission grid around the world. And that's precisely when the industrialist J.P. Morgan stopped bankrolling him, because he realized if the whole world gets free energy, how could he profit off of it?
Other time.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention? I've just been handed an urgent news story, and I need all of you to stop what you're doing and listen.
On the go? Still want to listen? Don't have one of those fancy phones with too many buttons. Don't know what an app is? Or you don't even care? Well, we got you here at Revolution Radio. Now you can dial in 24/7 to listen to our shows. We have a number for Studio A and Studio B, and best of all, it's free. Don't forget, carrier charges for your cell phone provider may apply, though, so check with your cell provider to make sure. So ready? Here you go. Get a pen. Here's the number. Studio A is 712-432-6958, and Studio B is 716-748-0112. Thank you very much for listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported radio station in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Barbara Jean Lindsay, the Cosmic Oracle. If you have questions about your past lives or future plans, need answers from the cosmos about your love life or career, or just want to keep your finger on the pulse of the planet, check out my show, The Cosmic Oracle, here on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com.
Looking for a nightcap to fill your listening needs? Come join us on Spaced Out Radio with me, Dave Scott, right here on Revolution Radio. Monday through Friday for 3 hours a night, starting at 9 p.m. Pacific, midnight Eastern, we will take you down the supernatural path. From ET contact to the paranormal and all of the spiritual, cryptid, and conspiracy stories in between. You can find us right here on Revolution Radio, at spacedoutradio.com, on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio, and on Facebook at Spaced Out Radio Show. Spaced Out Radio. It's a night of talk and interaction. Are you experienced?
Hello, Karl Marx here. Look at my wonderful hair. Notice how I sweep it back.
Karl?
I call it the 360 sweep. Beard, sideburns, and the magnificent coif.
Karl!
What? Was is this?
You're on the radio. They can't see you.
Oh, yeah, I get confused. Want to learn more about the Marxist agenda and other important stuff? Listen to The Ultimate Remedy with L.B. Bork, Tuesdays, 6 p.m. Eastern, right here on Revolution Radio.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and Freedom